In the summer of 1993, on the way to the Rainbow Gathering in Ireland, I borrowed a book from a friend of mine on Cape Cod. The book is called The Book of the Hopi. It's written by Frank Waters and published by Viking Press in 1961. It tells a story of the Hopi from the vantage point of 30 Hopi elders that Frank Waters interviewed. And in 1994, as I was standing in the middle of that archaeological site in Big Sur, and I asked the universe, what is this place? What I saw was a village. I remembered that book and the story that was told in that book. And it goes something like this. That the nephew of the Great Spirit had purified the world 3 times previously. The first time by fire, the second time by ice, and the third time by flood. And that each time, those who remembered to keep the tops of their heads open to the rest of the universe were told to go to a certain place and do a certain thing in order to survive the purification. The first 2 times, they were told to go into the earth and join the ant people. And the third time, they were directed to go to a mountaintop where they watched the floodwaters come and the floodwaters recede. And then they were told to build these craft and head off in a certain direction. And as they crossed the ocean, they eventually came to a place they said that was like paradise. They were told that it would be too easy and for them to keep going. And again, they came to another island that was paradise. And again they were told, no, this would be too easy and for them to keep going. Eventually, they said that they came to a place where they knew this must be the place, this must be the landmass. But they said that the cliffs were so sheer, they couldn't land. So they rode north and they rode south. And finally, they just let the current take them, and it landed them on this beach where they were met by Spider-Woman, the nephew of the Great Spirit, and the Kachinas, who were said to be beings from one of the planets and star system. They were told that yes, this was indeed the place, but it wasn't their ultimate destination. That before they arrived at their ultimate destination, which was said to be a place called the center of the universe, Oriidi, which is now in northeastern Arizona, that before they were allowed to arrive there, that each of the clans would have to make its migrations to the edges of the landmass. That meant all the way to Tierra del Fuego, the southern tip of South America, all the way to the Arctic Circle, all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, and my theory is that they were already at the edge of the Pacific. That when each of the clans reached the edges of the landmass, that half the clans would turn left and half the clans would turn right before returning to the center. Thus, each clan would travel what we call a swastika. And if you put both of those together, you end up with a circle with a cross in it. What I envisioned as I was standing there in the middle of that archaeological site was that this may have been the place that they made their emergence into the fourth world. Because to them, this is the fourth world. Because the nephew of the Great Spirit has purified the world 3 times previously. I was just in a place where I really felt like I needed to get clear, have a conversation with the universe, and figure out what else I was doing with the rest of my life. The year before, I had gone to this man-made hot springs in the Ansbergo Desert called Oh My God Hot Springs. So I decided that would be a really good place for me to just go hang out and paint my brains out. I'd gotten enough canvas to paint for a while and had like a bag of rice and enough food for a month, really, if I stretched it. So I gave a friend a ride out there. It's about an hour and a half east of San Diego, about 40 miles south of Palm Springs. And there were, a number of other people camped out there, buses, and people that didn't really have any place better to go and nothing better to do. Some of those were my good friends from the year before. It's a really quiet, tremendously quiet place, and it's really easy to hear this sound, the sound of silence there. And cold at night, warm in the day. Over the next couple of days, I just, set up my easel and started painting my brains out. Within the first 3 to 5 days or so, I started to experience this sense of euphoria, sense of bliss. and it stayed with me 24 hours a day. Around that time, I started to read Autobiography of a Yogi by Yogananda. Around page 300, there's a footnote that talks about the sound that I was hearing in the desert, the sound of silence. It talks about it being Om and to the Hindus, and Amin to the Muslims, and Amen to the Christians and the Egyptians and the Hebrews, and to the Tibetans, they call it Hum. It also talks about it that it's the Holy Spirit, and I realized that at that moment, when I was reading that and I was listening and feeling euphoric, and I was listening to the sound of the desert, I realized that the sound that I'd been hearing was divine consciousness, and that I felt this tremendous sense of relief in a way, and of, in a way, vindication, because what that said is that I could listen to the sound and recognize that it was divinity. I could be in divine communion. I could commune with the divine anytime I wanted to, just by listening to the sound. Just as I always thought when I was a kid, 5, 6 years old, and I would go into the woods, and that would be like, for me, going to church, whereas, being brought up kind of reluctantly a Catholic, going to church, the whole idea was that you needed to go to church, or you needed priests and clergy and all that sort of stuff in order to be in communion with God, and that always felt wrong to me, like almost a violation to me to put that forward as the truth. And when I knew in my bones that all you needed was to reach out. And so in the desert, at that moment, reading that footnote, it just affirmed, I felt this affirmation that I could experience, I could be and remain in divine communion at will for the rest of my life. From then on, I consciously practiced remembering to be in divine communion as often as I could come to awareness. And this sense of euphoria and bliss was all that was happening for me. After a month or so, I went out of the desert, came out of the desert, drove pretty much straight west because I wanted to go to Yogananda's ashram in Encinitas, which was literally, as the crow flies, pretty much straight over the mountains from where I was. And so I started to drive straight west. At Borrego Springs, I called my mother after being in the desert for a month and said, "Hey, Mom," told her what was up, that I was experiencing this euphoria, that I was experiencing this divine communion, and she was blown away. She was like, she could tell in my voice. She said, "Oh, it sounds like you've come so far in such a short time." Started to drive up over the hill and up onto the plateau that separates the ocean from the desert. Cleveland National Forest is there, and Mount Palomar and all that. About 50 yards up the road, there was a hitchhiker, and his name was Dugan Yakel. It's funny how you remember people's names, but he had a pretty incredible story. Just before I dropped him off, he said, "Have you ever been up to Mount Palomar?" I remember when I was in college, I took a couple of astronomy courses, and the textbooks, often the photographs that they had had credits for Mount Palomar, so that's how I knew there was an observatory there. He said, "Oh, you have to go up," because we were actually driving by the base of it. He says, "Oh, you have to do that." And so I was like, okay. When I dropped him off, I spent the night on the side of the road, and the next day I found the road, the fire road that goes up the back side of Mount Palomar, the east side of Mount Palomar. And the road was so steep that I was just really hoping that it went all the way through and down the other side, because I did not want to have to come down it again. When I got to the top, there's two peaks to Mount Palomar. One is where the fire tower is, and the other side is where the observatories are. Right as I got to the top of the fire tower, I looked straight up, straight overhead, and there was a sailplane being towed by a propeller-driven plane. And right at that moment, it disconnected from the tow line, and you could hear the clunk of the disconnection. I mean, it was straight overhead by about maybe 50 feet. From that point, that sailplane, it could have sailed all the way to San Diego, the height we were at. And I felt this tremendous sense of arrival, like I was on time. So that night, I climbed into my bus and went to sleep. I woke up around 3 in the morning. I think this was around January 16th or 17th, 18th, something like that. I heard this rumble that I'd been hearing in the desert off and on for a month. The sound was too big to be man-made. From where I sat, I could see the lights of LA and I could see the lights of San Diego, but I looked over towards the lights of LA. I spent another 5 days up there till I ran out of popcorn because I was just feeling so much euphoria. It felt so good to be there. And I painted some, and I just got all sorts of revelation coming to me. And I think that's probably when I started to write this book. And the book was called The Book of Whispers. It was all these ideas that were coming to me, what I was experiencing through this state of divine communion, this state of bliss. And except that what I was doing is I had a whole shoebox full of my old postcards. I had this old postcard company. There were probably like 100 different designs, and I got them into like 40 stores in the Boston, Cambridge area back in the mid-'80s. And I had leftovers. I had this whole shoebox, and they were black and white line drawings on one side and blank on the backs. And I used the backs of those to draw, like a cartoon, the ideas that were coming to me through this period of revelation. And so I would just, every day I'd take a stack of those cards, and I would just, by the end of the day, they would just be filled with the inspiration that came that day. Because what would happen is, even when I was in the desert, I would do a lot of daydreaming, and I would be standing there in the washes or just standing there out in the desert, and all of a sudden an idea would come, and all this information would come, and it wasn't me, it wasn't things that I knew about, but it all made sense. It had the resonance of truth. It literally felt like the truth. And then all this information would be coming, and then I would come back into myself, and I'd realize that I'd been standing there for like 20 minutes, a half an hour, 45 minutes of just feeling bliss while receiving all this information, receiving all these connections. And at that point, I realized, that the universe is the library. And we're able to tap into it at any time. Anybody. One of the things I was told by the universe at that time was that what I was experiencing, every soul on this planet was capable of. I also was told that a time would come when I'd be able to share this information with people. After spending 5 days up on Mount Palomar, it felt like it was time to come back down to Earth, literally, having had my head up in the clouds, thankfully, and blessedly. So I drove down to Encinitas. At this point, I decided I wanted to learn Kriya Yoga. That's what Yogananda's book was all about. He brought Kriya Yoga to the West, so I figured I'd learn what Kriya Yoga is. So when I got to the ashram, I made an appointment with the head monk there. He had a couple of appointments ahead of me, so I went for a walk, and while I was wandering around, wondering what the connection was between the colors of the flowers and all the information that I had been given, I felt like these colors, there was some esoteric knowledge to why these flowers had these colors. And as I was trying to ponder that, I overheard this conversation. I heard these people talking about an earthquake in Los Angeles. And I went up to them and I said, "Excuse me, what are you talking about, an earthquake in Los Angeles? What are you talking about?" And they said, "Where have you been?" And I said, "Well, I've been in the wilderness for the past week or month or whatever, but what's happened?" And they said that there had been an earthquake. And I realized that that's the sound that I had heard that night. A few days later, it became apparent that I really needed to go up to Santa Cruz. I drove from San Diego up through Los Angeles, and this is only a week or so after the earthquake. And the epicenter of that earthquake was Northridge in the San Fernando Valley. And if you know LA at all, you know that if you're driving north on the 405, there's a place where it goes over the mountain, the Santa Monica Mountains, and when you get to the top of that mountain, you're looking into the center of the San Fernando Valley, straight at Northridge and the epicenter of that quake. And so as I'm driving up, it was a beautiful morning, I'm looking out into the epicenter of the quake, and I asked the universe, why did this happen? Why did this happen? And the universe said, when a people in a place fail to keep a spiritual focus above a material focus, for at least 50% of their conscious waking state, over time, catastrophe is the result. This same information is the flip side of what I've been given to understand as to why I was experiencing when I was experiencing the sense of euphoria, because the universe said that when the way to perpetuate this experience of bliss is when a person remains in divine communion for at least 51% of their conscious waking state, that harmony is the result, and harmony is our natural state. We return to our natural state of harmony. With that, I drove up to Santa Cruz and drove down into Big Sur. The morning of the first day, I pulled off on the side of the road in Big Sur, and I was drawing the Book of Whispers from the night's revelations. I found myself waking up before dawn, fully charged, and all night in my dreams, all this information would be coming. And as I'm waking up with all this inspiration, even more connections would be made. And so I would just grab a stack of cards and just start drawing. The next thing I know, a couple of hours have gone by, and I'm still lying there in bed drawing information. And this sheriff came by and told me that I couldn't park on the side of the road. And I knew that I was really close to the Los Padres National Forest. So I just started the car and started driving south looking for a road into the National Forest. It started raining. I eventually found this dirt road, thinking that I'm just looking for a place that I can pull over. The road gets steeper and the rain's coming down even more and more, and the road gets even steeper and the rain is really pouring buckets at this point. The road is so steep that I can't stop, or I'm afraid that the car is going to slip off the mountain. And there's nowhere to turn around. It's just keep going forward. I'm only in first gear at this point. It's that steep. Try to keep a good torque on the engine, and there was a point where it was really, really dicey. Like if I didn't keep that engine going up, it was definitely going to slide off the hill. At this point, I'm probably about 2 or 3 miles up the road. Eventually, about 4 miles up, I find a spot that's flat enough, and I turn around and I park. And it rained for 5 days. And, there was no coming down that road until that road dried out. But it was fine. After 5 days, the sun came out. It was beautiful. And during those 5 days, I spent writing and reading Mary Baker Eddy's book and writing my own book. And when the rain stopped, I hiked to the top of the mountain. What I discovered was just rolling hills, green grass, pasture, and every once in a while there would be this, what from a distance looks like an oak tree, just a little oak tree. But when you get up to it, it would probably take 3 to 5 people to put your arms around it. It was a beautiful place. There was a herd of cattle that was grazing, and so I went back down and got the bus and drove it up to the top of the hill. I found a campsite and I parked, and that's basically where I spent the next 2 weeks. Every day I would take a stack of the cards and just go hiking. All this inspiration would come by the end of the day. I would have filled up 150 cards. This place was such that you were looking down on the clouds, and every once in a while the clouds would start racing up the hill, but they would dissipate before they got to the top, so it looked like a carpet of clouds all the way to the horizon. It was a pretty, just beautiful, magnificent place. Every day I'd wake up before dawn and draw out my inspirations from the night's dreams, and then eventually I'd go and practice standing on my head, which is something I'd always wanted to learn how to do, but in this state of bliss, something said, go ahead and what are you going to do? Just fall over, So I started standing on my head and found that I could do it, and so that was how I began each day. And then I would go hiking. One of the things I discovered from traveling around is that in every environment, even in the desert, there's something that grows there, some kind of leaf or grass, that if you put it in your mouth and don't chew it up, or you just put it in your mouth and you just suck on it like a pebble, it will sustain you. Not only won't you be thirsty, but you'll also feel a certain amount of power and energy from it. And in the Ansberego desert, it was a chaparral that I would go hiking with. But here, up in Big Sur, when the hillsides came together, there's this shrub that's called bay laurel. It's something like a melaleuca or tea tree. It's aromatic like that. And this shrub, it needs a lot of water. That's why it grows where the hillsides come together, right? So I would just take a leaf of that, and all afternoon as I'm hiking along, I've got it in my mouth, and I would just bite into it and just let it sit in my mouth as I'm walking. So one day I was sitting in the side door of the bus, and I was looking towards one of the hilltops, about maybe less than a quarter mile away. I was at eye level, but there was like a gully between us. And I noticed that in between me and the hilltop, after the gully, on the other side, there was like a saddle of land just down from this knoll. And that the herd of cattle, no matter where else it went, it always seemed to return to that little saddle. It really liked that little bit of pasture. And then I noticed something really odd about that knoll. I noticed that there was what looked to me like bay laurel growing out of the top of this knoll. And I was like, whoa, that's weird. That means that there's water under there. And then looking closer from where I was, I noticed that there was a stone sticking up. And then I noticed that there was this earthwork that was in front of it. And I was up, and I was like, what the heck is that? I'm just talking to myself, what is that? What is that thing? And I get over there, and sure enough, there's the whole knoll is surrounded by these earthworks. And I thought it was, some farmer had, with a bulldozer had made these, wheelies around this knoll. But they were too ornate for that. It wasn't a mistake. Somebody had actually built these. And then what I noticed when I climbed up on the knoll was that there was one stone, very sharp on one side, carved in place and to the west, and two stones in the east, and that they lined up. And as I stood there, I'm like, what is this? I started to get a picture. So, 10 years go by, and on the weekend of 9/11, 2004, I drove up the road. I drove up the road to the site and spent the weekend there with a video camera and a still camera, did a photo survey of the site. And at the end of the weekend, I, drove back down to Highway 1, and by coincidence, there were Forest Service people at the Forest Service station there, and I was able to ask them, what they knew about it, and they didn't know anything about it, and they gave me a number of the zone archaeologists. I had been spending most of my winters selling prints of my paintings on Venice Boardwalk, and that's basically how I supported myself. When I got back to LA, I uploaded the images to a laptop, put 30 of them on my website, and then I called the zone archaeologist and had a very interesting conversation. What she told me was that they didn't know anything about this site. So I told her about the photographs and the website, and she looked at them and that she was really busy and that she'd want to try to get over there if she could before the winter came on, and that she'd give me a call when she did. And basically nothing ever happened, nothing ever came of that. But I asked her a couple of questions about that area, and one of the things she said is that they'd never found any stone circles or ceremonial sites like that on the West Coast. Another thing that she said was that the oldest artifacts that they found in that area go back about 10,000 years. Playing with this at night on my computer, getting on the website and everything like that, in the daytime working on the boardwalk, 3 very coincidental events happened. I get a call from a friend of mine out of the blue, and I told her about this ceremonial site and the photographs and everything, and she immediately said, "Oh, you should talk to my friend. He's an archaeologist for the Forest Service at part-time, and he's also connected with the Hopi Nation." I was like, perfect, So she gave me his phone number. I called him. I told him about the pictures on the website, and he was really excited about them, and we tried to make plans to go up there together. Another thing that happened, this other friend of mine shows up out of the blue. He just happened to be in town on some family business coming from Hawaii. And I told him about and showed him the photographs. And he was like, "Have you ever heard the story of Daddy Bray?" And I was like, "No." He goes, "Daddy Bray was a Hawaiian kahuna. He received a message that he should come to the mainland. So he comes to the mainland, and he travels up and down the West Coast looking for why he's supposed to be here. Eventually he ended up in LA. There at the time had been this print shop that was owned by Native Americans, and he found these folks and was staying with them for a few days, and eventually he was like, "Well, I think I'm going to go home." And they said, "Oh, you're going back to Hopi land?" And he was like, "Hopi land? Where's that?" And they said, "Oh, we thought you were Hopi." He says, "No, I'm Hawaiian. I'm going back to Hawaii." And that's when he figured that the reason why he had come was to go to Hopi land. So they made arrangements for him to be announced, because he, being a kahuna, he's a person of stature and needed to be announced to have a formal meeting with the Hopi elders. The meeting takes place, and during the meeting there didn't seem to be any, they couldn't really figure out why there wasn't anything significant coming to light until the end, when they were about to do their formal parting, and he asked permission to sing the song of his lineage. And when he sang the song of his lineage, the Hopi were amazed. They were able to finish the song. And so the story goes that once a long time ago, a group of Hopi received a message. Their relatives were in trouble in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And so they made their way to the coast from Arizona, and they headed off in boats and were never heard from again. Well, his Daddy Bray showing up confirmed for them that they, he was one of their descendants and that they had made it. So what that said to me is that there was a connection between the Hopi and the Polynesians. And another thing that happened that week was I figured that what I really needed at that time was to talk to an archeo-astronomer. I just put it out there, calling in an archeo-astronomer. And this woman this older woman came by my booth, and she'd been by a few times to see my work over the years. She'd come by every 6 or 9 months or whatever. And invariably, we would get interrupted and she would leave before I had a chance to find out more about her. Well, just by coincidence, that week she came by, and I said, what do you do? She says, I'm an astronomer for UCLA. And I was like, really? Well, and I told her the whole story and showed her the pictures, and she said, you should talk to Ed Krupp. And I was like, who's Ed Krupp? She said, he's the director of the Griffith Observatory. You should just call him up. I was like, really? It's like, yeah. So I did. And he answered the phone. and I told him what I had. And, I sent him to the website. And when I called him back a couple of days later and asked him about his experience his feeling of the pictures, he's like, there was nothing there. And I was like, what? And I went online, and sure enough, all the pictures were gone. I'm like, this is so weird. I put him up again, and I called him up, and I said, and I talked him through him, and I gave him my theory about it being connected to the Hopi and their place of emergence. And he was skeptical. But he recommended I talked about the fact that I thought that this place was related to the equinoxes. He was also very skeptical. He said, read my book and we'll talk again. And so we left it at that. Another strange thing that happened that week, another coincidence, the last coincidence of that series, was this friend of mine came through town. And she is from Peebles, Ohio. Her name's Juniper. She's a Rainbow Sister. And she had come to town to visit a mutual friend. And I showed them the photographs and everything. And I told her what my theory was about it. And in the fall of 1999, I'd gone to visit her just after Thanksgiving. It was about 2 weeks before the winter solstice. By coincidence, in her town, there is this mound called the Serpent Mound. There's a lot of theories about what the Serpent Mound is. It's a mound that has, in the south, 3 spiral coils of the serpent, and then it arcs to the north and makes 7 loops. And then there's what looks like a mouth around an egg at the top of the crescent that is in the north. And the whole thing is on top of this bluff that overlooks this creek. And what she told me about this creek, it's called Ohio Brush Creek. And they know, she said, this creek is one of the oldest creeks in North America. I said, how do you know it's one of the oldest creeks in North America? She's like, because it exposes this ancient coral bed that is exposed here by this creek and over by Cincinnati by the Ohio River. And we know how old that is. So I was like, wow, and literally this creek goes right around if you're standing right on the edge where the Serpent Mound is, if you look straight down, there's the creek. It kind of loops around the bluff. So like, Serpent Mound, interesting. She said that week she came through and I showed her the pictures and I told her my theory that, well, I'll get into the theory. This may have been the place that the Hopi made their emergence into the fourth world and began their migrations, and that they needed to migrate to the 4 directions. And she said, you know what? Adams County, where the Serpent Mound is a really unique place because they've discovered that there's flora and fauna that are only found in Adams County and Texas. My theory is that the Serpent Mound was created by the Serpent Clan of the Hopi, making their migration from south to north, which gets into what my grand theory is about this whole thing. One day you have a dream, and the dream is that there's going to be a flood. And let's say you have a couple of dreams like that, and you find out you're not the only one having that dream, and a whole lot of people are having dreams like that in your village or in your family. And eventually you have a dream that tells you to go to the top of a mountain. And you and your family and maybe even your village, you travel there and you discover that there's all these other people up on top of this mountain. And so you're not entirely crazy, because everybody else is having the same dreams and visions. And then it happens. The flood happens. And now all you people that are up there, you're not all farmers, you're not all fishermen, everybody's got different skills. But now you just watched the destruction of the world. You're the survivors. And you're survivors that were directed by the Great Spirit, whoever gave you those dreams. And, not everybody that's there had those dreams, but, they either trusted somebody that had a dream, or they are related to somebody that had a dream, and they're in some ways grateful for having lived. And of course there would be some that would be pretty devastated by having survived. So, but now, the dreamers, the visionaries, the psychics, they have these dreams that say, okay, now you have to build these craft. You can't stay on this mountain. Although there's plenty of food and seed and deer and whatnot to support you for a time. Eventually, you're going to have to move. And so the psychics say the message is that you have to build craft. So you band together into work parties, and there's enough forest for you to build boats or rafts, and you build these craft. And those of you that know enough about sailing, you take command and you sail off together. You prepare, you collect as much food as you possibly can, and you head off, trusting in the same force that got you to the top of the mountain, as told to you, as interpreted to you by the psychic people amongst you. And you sail across the ocean, and you fish for food, and you eat your stores, and eventually you come to a place, after perhaps months, you come to a place that is paradise. You get off the boat finally, especially because not all of you are into boats. Some of you are just farmers, and you just rather just sit still in one place. And you get off the boat, and there's bananas in the trees, and coconuts and pineapples, and there's fresh water and whatnot, and you're just really glad to have found. You think that this must be the place because it's paradise. It's better than any place you've ever seen. But the psychics say, no, this is not the ultimate destination. There's a better place. And they say, this place would be too easy. And you're all like, what? But you trust in the Spirit that has saved you to this point, and you get back on the boats, and you sail back out to sea, and eventually you come to another island, another paradise, enough to replenish, and you get off. And there are some that are like, okay, I've had enough. I don't need to save the world. Bessie's about to have a baby, and we can't leave Bessie here by herself. We don't know how long this is going to take. We're just gonna stay here. This is good. This is good. We know we'll be in touch. We'll be in communication psychically, and you'll know where we are. And so a contingent of people stay, and the rest go on the mission. And they head off. And months pass, and eventually they come to land. And they know this must be the place, because it's so much more vast. But they look ahead and they see that the cliffs are too sheer. The cliffs are there's nowhere to land. So they rowed north and they rowed south, and finally they just stopped rowing and they just let the current take them. And eventually it lands them on this beach. And they get off the boats, and sure enough, the nephew of the Great Spirit arrives, and there's Spider-Woman. and there are these beings from other planets and star systems, and they're communicated with directly, and they're told, welcome, yes, this is indeed the place where you will make your emergence into the fourth world. But this is not your ultimate destination. Your ultimate destination is a place we call the center of the universe, and it is miles from here. But before this generation arrives in that place, first of all, this generation will never arrive in that place, because this generation will begin a migration that will cover the landmass before returning to the center. One of the things that the Hopi say they were given at that meeting was a map of how the lands would be divided amongst the clans once the clans returned from their migrations in Oraibi, in the center of the universe. And they were also given this figurine that looks like a humanoid, but one arm is broken off. And they have the broken figurine, and the arm that's missing was given to a person that they called the true white brother. And it was said that at the end of the age, the true white brother would return with that stone, and they would know that he was the true white brother because he would have that artifact. So these folks, having survived the destruction of the world, having survived a journey across the ocean, having left some of their party in the middle of the ocean on some islands, they have now arrived, and they've been told, okay, now that your journey begins. You're going to need to travel the whole continent before you, and another continent attached to it, ultimately. And you will not in your lifetime arrive at the final destination. So that day that I discovered the first site, I stood there in the middle of it, and I saw this village. I saw people hunting the ample deer that I saw in that area. And I saw that there were two springs at the base of that little saddle between the knoll and another hill. So that told me that there was water there for them. Any road map drawing a line from this site to Hopi land, it's on the same exact parallel. Along that line, there are 8 or 9 mountain passes within a 20 to 40 mile variance off of the line. It turns out that if you look on any road map, that there are, from this site to Oraibi, there are at least every 25 to 30 miles, there is a water source, either a spring, a hot spring, a river, a stream. And as it happens, an army travels 25 miles in a day on foot. It's not that far-fetched for people who have made a migration across that expanse. 5 years go by from that week after taking the photographs. So I'm driving up through Big Sur, a couple 100 yards past the road. And I just happen, while I'm looking at the gas gauge, I just happen to look out the window toward the ocean and feel the goodness of the day. It was a cloudless day. It was just beautiful. I looked out to my left, and I was like, did a double take, literally. And I was like, is that what I think it is? And somebody said, you have to stop and turn around and go look. So I stopped and turned around, and I went back and parked the car. And I ran across this big meadow. And at the far end of the meadow, there were these huge stones. And they're surrounded by this shrubbery, and it looked to me like this was a stone circle. But I couldn't actually see how the stones made a circle. They were that far apart and that big. So I climbed on a couple of them, just tried to figure it out, but finally I just said, I'm going to just keep going, and when I get back to civilization, I'll take a look at a satellite. I need to see what this looks like from the air, right? When I got back to my car, I took a couple of photographs of what it looked like from the road, intending to put them on my webpage. And then a couple of weeks later, I was back in LA, and I was in the middle of a conversation with my friend, and she had just handed me an article that had been taken from the web about the Mayan long count. And on the cover of this article, there was a pentagram inside of a pentagram. And I do sacred geometry, a lot of sacred geometry work, and, I've seen that before, I've drawn it before. I actually painted a painting in Big Sur of that same image a few years ago. I just parked on one of those turnouts in Big Sur one afternoon and painted a painting of the scene that I was looking at, the coastline. When I got back to LA, I drew a pentagram inside of a pentagram on this painting of Big Sur. So I was, obviously familiar with this image, but I looked at it, and then I started to read the article. I turned the page, and about halfway down the page, I remembered that I was, supposed to look that Big Sur site up. So I got on a computer and I pull up the image, and within 2 seconds, I saw that it was a pentagram inside of a pentagon. I was taken back to that morning when I was standing there amongst those rocks, and I asked, what is this place? And how does it relate to that place that I found up on top of the mountain, up on top of the crest of the Pacific Range? Because at the time I had been thinking that the place up top was the main site. But just to the south of this stone circle was this beach that was, the Hopis said that they made landfall, but they couldn't land because the cliffs were so sheer. Now, I've been all the way up and down the west coast, from about 200 miles down to Baja, all the way up into Vancouver Island. And there's about 5 places that fit that description. But this place is the only place that's on the exact same latitudinal line as Oriibi. And there is a beach right there that is the longest stretch of beach that's accessible in Big Sur. And on the south end of it, there is a creek, a freshwater creek. There is this huge meadow that I had to cross in order to get to this stone circle. And when I was there, when I asked the question, this picture started to emerge. And I saw that this would have been the village. Having crossed the ocean, survived the destruction of the world, having brought with you all the seeds you could muster, when you made landfall, you would have to find out what time it is, the best time to plant those seeds. And if you're supposed to go on these migrations and split up, it'd be best if you didn't just divide up the seeds that you had, but that you multiplied those seeds. At the same time, it would be best if you used the arable land that's there, one of the flattest stretches of land in Big Sur, to grow those seeds, to grow enough food for yourselves and enough seeds to divide amongst all the clans. At the same time, if you've witnessed a world destruction, let's say that world destruction included something or was caused by something like a polar shift, where you didn't know what north, south, east, and west was, or the length of the year was the same, or if the length of the day was the same. You would have to build something in order to figure that sort of thing out. All the ancient temples had to build a structure in order to figure out what the astrological significance of that specific spot was in order to align that temple to heaven and earth. My theory was that site at the top was something that tells you the declination or the position of the planets in relation to the celestial equator. The celestial equator is, if you picture the equator of the Earth as a plate extending out into space, then the orbits of the planets cross that plate in two places. The moon, it crosses that plate twice a month. The sun crosses that plate twice a year. And where the sun crosses that plate, it's the equinoxes. And it's not really the sun crossing that plate, it's actually the Earth tilting. The reason why the Earth appears to tilt on its axis, relative to the orbital plane of it and around the sun, is because the majority of the mass of the Earth is in the northern hemisphere. And so the Earth kind of tilts over approximately 23 to 24 degrees, and it varies over a 40,000 year period. This tilt causes the seasons. There's a possibility, there's a theory that the reason why the ancients have a big emphasis on the number 360 plus 5 days is because there's a possibility that there were once 360 days to the year, and that something happened a long time ago that made the length of the year extended. There are myths in both the Mayan culture and the Egyptian culture that try to explain why there are 360 plus 5 days. Imagine if that happened from the last world destruction, the last world purification, that these folks would have to figure out what is the length of the year, and in so doing, they'd be able to plant their food when they needed to at the right time, and figure out exactly what time it is. The declinator is going to be able to tell you where you are on the Earth in terms of how far north or south of the equator. It's going to be able to tell you what true east, west, north, and south are. Now, this gets into what was the true purpose of the migration of the Hopi. The goal of the migrations may have been for the Hopi to travel to all the sacred sites, the earth energy sites of these two continents, and hold ceremony at those places before returning to the center of the grid. And as it happens, Hopi land sits on uranium. It's one of the only places where there is naturally occurring uranium on the planet. There's another place, and it's in Australia. And this place in Australia is where the native Aborigines say the head of the rainbow serpent that came to Earth is buried. And it's interesting that in both places Western cultures have been mining uranium and trying to get the natives off their land so they can mine uranium, and it's the same struggle that's going on in both places. Native culture versus our need for nuclear weapons. But for some reason, the Great Spirit decided that the best place for the survivors of last world destruction to remain would be the center of the universe, a place where there's uranium underground, and only after they went to all the sacred sites in North America, naturally occurring sacred sites, and held ceremony in those places. So to me, it's kind of like, my theory is that their purpose in going was to basically rewire the grid. I mean, the grid is there, but rewire humanity's connection to the grid. Because these folks were descendants of the true believers, those who had kept the tops of their heads open to the rest of the universe, and were willing to cross an ocean on direction and felt the need to live a life that was in harmony with the Great Spirit. If you look at Hopi history, it hasn't always been that way. There's definitely been a conflict, many conflicts. And one of the reasons for the migrations would have also have been to repopulate the land, because some of the Hopis will tell you that not all the clans have returned yet. And if there are many places like Serpent Mound, they were mysteriously made, and nobody knows what happened to the people that made them, because they just suddenly disappeared. And the theory is that, my theory at least, is that they were these places, these cultures that suddenly disappeared, were Hopi clans that suddenly decided that now is the best time for us to continue our migrations. I think that that part of the story has been repeated many times throughout North, South, and Central America, and that the Hopi may have been the seed peoples that began all of these different cultures that have remained since over the past 10,000 years, because there's a good possibility that the flood happened 10 to 12,000 years ago, and that one of the reasons why the flood happened was the melting of the last ice age from about 25,000 BC until about 12,000 BC. Imagine if you've got a huge ice sheet that's pressing down on the earth, and then it melts, and it flows through rivers and whatnot, and eventually the weight of that ice and that water has moved, and then the land would rise up, and this would happen over several thousand years. At some point, and in some places, it may not be a really gentle heaving of the land, like a sponge. It's possible that huge swaths of the earth experienced a flood of those proportions. And so the pentacle on the ground, my theory is that they used that great meadow to grow their food. If you're trying to figure out what time it is after world destruction in terms of having to restart your calendar, anybody that studied calendar sciences knows that all these ancient cultures paid really close attention to Venus. And one of the reasons why you would pay such close attention to Venus is because you'd look for things that are standards that you can count on. Now, most people would say, you'd look for the North Star. But, as it happens, there are only 3 times in 26,000 years that there is actually a star at the North Pole. And we just happen to live, by coincidence, in one of those times. Another time is 12,500 years ago. And it isn't the pole, it's not Polaris that's there, it's Vega that's there. And there's another time, I think it's around 3,000 BC, there's a star called Thuban, Thuban, that's in the constellation Draco, that is a pole star. But other than that, the majority of the time, there are no stars that are right at the North Pole. And so you can't really count on that as a standard if you're trying to reestablish your calendar. But what you can count on is the orbit of Venus. Venus has the most perfectly circular of all the orbits of the planets. In 8 years, it inscribes in the sky a pentagram. It has a period, what's called the synodic period, means to be observer on Earth. Venus has this period of 584 days. That period begins when Venus appears 1 minute before the sun at sunrise. It's called the heliacal rising of Venus. And so then for the next 260 days, it spends as the morning star. Then it disappears for a little bit, and then it reappears as the evening star for 260 days, which, is the length of the Mayan Solkin, or sacred calendar, 260 days. It's also really close to the human gestation period of 9 months. And then it disappears for a little bit, and then reappears in a sign of the zodiac, in a constellation that is approximately 144 degrees away from where it was 584 days earlier. And then 584 days later, it appears in another sign that is 144 degrees away from where it was 584 days earlier. Then 584 days, 584 days, 584 days. After 8 years, it's returned to where it was within nearly a degree of where it was 8 years before. So what that means is that every day of the year is in a harmonic, an 8-year harmonic, with a day that was 8 years, that happened 8 years ago and 8 years in the future. And thus the planet Venus is associated with the pentagram, and it's associated with the number 8. This is something that, you can pretty much count on happening. And it's also the reason why, Venus is considered the planet of harmony. And as it happens, a pentagram, every line in a pentagram is in phi ratio with every other line in a pentagram. There are no lines that are not in phi ratio with another line in the pentagram. And every triangle in a pentagram is a golden mean triangle, that when you divide it in a certain way, it repeats the golden mean to infinity. So in thinking about why Venus would be important to people that have witnessed the world destruction, and they're trying to establish what time it is and establish where they are on the planet, you would have to establish when the spring equinox is. And there are certain ways to do that, and one of those ways has been described by Noah's grandfather or great-grandfather, Enoch, in what's called the Book of Enoch, of which there are, I think, 12 or 13 different copies or fragments of copies found amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls by the Qumran community. The Book of Enoch is actually a book of books, and within the Book of Enoch there is a book called the Book of the Luminaries, which means, the heavenly bodies. And in it describes how, and all this information comes from a book called Uriel's Machine. These two British Masons, Knight and Lomas, were researching the roots of Masonry, and they started looking into Noah and the Book of Enoch. They discovered the Book of the Luminaries. And within this Book of the Luminaries, it describes how one day Enoch was taken up by the angel Uriel, according to the Bible. He was taken up into the north or taken up into the sky and shown many things, and returned to earth, told to, share all this information, and then it says that Enoch walks with God, whereas all the other patriarchs, it says, and then, he had many sons and daughters, and then he died. Well, with Enoch, it says he had many sons and daughters, and then Enoch walks with God. Another way of looking at this is that Enoch was taken up by a divine messenger, and a divine messenger could be anybody, and he was taken to the north, someplace in the north, and he was, shown many things, and then he was taken back to where he came from and told to share this information, and that he created a school, and that school became somewhat of a priesthood, and that priesthood may have evolved into the Sumerian priesthood, of which Abraham was a descendant. What's discussed is that one day he saw these two divine messengers heading off, or angels, heading off in a certain direction. One had a rope and one had a stick, and he asked where they're going, and he was told they're going to measure. And then he goes into this description of how to create this thing, this sticklination, what these authors call a Uriel's Machine, and then they published a book called Uriel's Machine, named after the angel, the divine messenger, where with just a rope and a stick, you can figure out what time it is on a cosmic sense. You can create this structure that makes anywhere you are on the planet basically the bridge of the spaceship. And back in the winter of 1999, I had read the book the year before, and I was out on Kauai, camped on this nude beach for about 2 weeks. I'd been fasting for about a week or so, and this information from this book came, so I started to build a Uriel's machine out of the sand. And what you do is you stick a stick in the sand. When the sun rises, where the end of the shadow of the stick lands, you extend your rope to that length, and you put in the ground another stick. I did this on the spring equinox. I knew it was the equinox. The morning of the equinox, I woke up before dawn, and I climbed up to the top of this cinder cone, and I made a Uriel's machine. I stuck a stick in the ground, and I waited till the sun crested Haleakala, the volcano, and I know it wasn't the exact horizon, but it was as close as I could come. Then I put a stick in the ground at the western end of the shadow that the Seno stick cast. And I took a little rope, and I put another stick in the ground, and I put it the length between those two, and then made a circle around them. And that was the length between them, the radius of the circle. Where those two sticks line up, I put another stick 180 degrees from the other stick. And that told me, that little information, it told me where the sun was going to set that day and where the sun had risen that morning. Now that line between those three sticks, that's the equator. That's the celestial equator. Now I watched the shadow move for the next 7 hours until just past noon. On the equinox, all over the earth, no matter where you are, where the sun rises, that point on the horizon is true east. 180 degrees from that is true west. 90 degrees from that is north and south. If you watch that at noon, if there's a shadow and that shadow moves north, is cast north, it tells you that you are in the north. If that shadow casts south, then you are in the south of the equator. How far north tells you how far north of the equator you are. How far south tells you how far south you are of the equator. If you monitored this every day, what you would discover from the equinox, if you watch the sunrise and sunset points, that for the first month, after 30 days, the sun would have moved 12 degrees north from the spring equinox. Every day you mark the ground, and on the 30th day you put a pole in the ground. 30 more days, the sun is going to have moved another 8 degrees north of the equator from the equinox, the spring equinox. 30 more days, it's going to move 4 degrees, another 4 degrees farther north of the equator. So altogether, what you end up with is approximately 24 degrees north. That brings you up to the solstice. The word solstice means sun stands still. And so the sun stands still in the sky. It appears to stand still. It doesn't go any further north or south for about 3 days. And then it starts moving south again. And over the next 30 days, it moves 4 degrees south. Then it moves, the next 30 days, it moves another 8 degrees south. And the next 30 days, it moves another 12 degrees south. And then you're back at the autumnal equinox, and so forth. The next 30 days, it's going to move another 12 degrees south. Then the next 30 days, it's going to move another 8 degrees south. The next 30 days, move another 4 degrees south, and then it's going to stand still in the sky for 3 days, approximately, before moving north again. And that's this winter solstice. And then it does the same thing back again. Well, the ancients knew this, and all of this was started with just a rope and a stick, a rope standard and a stick standard. And that stick, I believe, is called a rod or a staff. After watching this for those 7 hours on Maui on the equinox back in 1999, it was such an intense meditation. And I walked around it. I felt that same sort of connection, divine communion that I did when I was in the desert. And I felt like all these ancient peoples that have, made it their life's purpose to look out for the people and to watch what time it is. And I was like, well, these people must have called themselves something, They must have thought of themselves in a certain way. I remembered that the Babylonians, our word for hour comes from the Babylonian word hour. And an hour was, they had 12-hour days, so one of their hours was 2 of our hours. And their word hour actually meant watch. That day I realized on Maui, looking at my little Uriel's machine, was that suddenly dawned on me that these people would have called themselves the Watchers because they did a 2-hour watch. What was an hour watch for them, but it was 2 of our hours. And that they were called the Watchers. And it turns out that term goes back to Sumerians that predate the Babylonians by 2,000 years. And in Sumerian the word is Ijiji. It means the Watchers, those who watch. And there's a lot written about the Watchers as those who they look out for humanity. They oversee what's happening. And when I was walking around my little Uriel's machine on top of the cinder cone that day, I felt the power of it. I felt that I was suddenly, I was on the bridge of the ship, and I felt connected to all those who had ever done this. And I felt that it was a sacred thing. It was a sacred calling. Because you really are in a way a guardian of time for the purpose of the betterment of the people and maintaining the sacred bond between heaven and earth. And so my theory when I was up in Big Sur at those ceremonial sites was that's what those 2 sites were for. The upper one is to monitor the spring equinox point to find out what true east, west, north, and south was and where they were in relation to that. The lower one was to gain a sense of how that relates to the Venus cycle. And that says to me, my initial idea was that these people having crossed the ocean and everything and needing to replenish their stores and get their land legs back, they would have probably stuck around for a couple of years. But then with the possibility of the pentagon site may be related to the cycle of Venus, says that they may have been around for at least 8 years and may have maintained a presence there, a lasting presence there, as a base, as a reference point, so that if you knew that your generation would never arrive or never be able to stay at your final destination, the center of the universe, you would at least send a party of people to go and see where your ultimate destination of your peoples was. And have them report back. Another possibility is that they may have moved altogether from this site in Big Sur to that place, and then to Oribe, to the center of the universe, and then split up north, south, east, and west from there.
In the summer of 1997, I was invited into a sweat lodge at a rainbow gathering in Colorado by a Native American brother who was leading the sweat. It was a traditional sweat lodge with four rounds of 7 stones each. And in the middle of the second round, a story was shared about why we were holding the sweat lodge. There were some guests, some family that had come from Arizona bearing a great gift. And we were told what this gift was and the story behind it. And the story goes like this. There was a Hopi elder whose name was Grandfather Titus. And Titus was a keeper, a bearer of this song. This song was handed down from father to son through the generations and was only to be sung once at the end of the age. And along with this song was passed down a bundle. And within this bundle there was a specific kind of corn seed. And this corn seed was to be planted once the song was sung at the end of the age. And this corn was said to stimulate cellular memory. And these folks in the sweat lodge had brought some of this corn as a gift to the family. Well, Grandfather Titus was living on the Hopi Reservation in northeastern Arizona. And one day in Maine, this man had a dream. And in this dream, he saw a man singing a song. And the dream was so vivid that he remembered it when he woke up. And it had such an impact on him that he asked his friends about it. And they all told him that he should try to go and find this person. And the universe being as it is, about a week and a half later, he found himself standing in front of Grandfather Titus in Hopi land. And he introduced himself. He recognized Grandfather Titus from the dream. And he began to sing the song. But it turns out that he only sang half of the song. And Grandfather Titus finished the other half of the song. Shortly after that, in the season after that, the corn was planted. And before the corn came up and was harvested and distributed amongst the people, Grandfather Titus passed away.
And so that's where I'm at right now. That's where what I'm thinking about, and we'll see. We'll see. So there. Take that. Sun's almost setting. Thank you for listening. We love you.